Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a topic that's been making waves across North America. The escalating trade war between the United States and Canada, sparked by President Trump's decision to slap hefty tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss any of our deep dives into global economics and trade. This one's a big story. And it's got implications for everyone, from factory workers in Ontario to shoppers at grocery stores in the US. So grab a coffee, settle in, and let's unpack what's going on. Let's start with the basics. Back in early 2025, President Donald Trump decided to flex some economic muscle by imposing a massive 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum imports. Now, if you're wondering what a tariff is, it's essentially a tax that a country places on imported goods to make them more expensive, encouraging people to buy domestic products instead. The idea here was to bring jobs back to American steel mills and aluminum plants, giving a boost to U.S. manufacturing. It's a classic protectionist move, something Trump has leaned into heavily, both in his first term and now in his second. The White House was banking on this policy being a home run. They figured that by making Canadian steel and aluminum pricier, American companies would turn to US producers, creating a flood of new jobs in places like Pittsburgh or Ohio. It sounds good on paper, right? Protect local industries, bring back manufacturing jobs, and make America's industrial heartland thrive again. But here's the thing about tariffs. They're like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples don't always go where you expect. And sometimes they cause a bigger splash than you planned for. Let's head north to Canada, where these tariffs were supposed to hit hard. Instead, something surprising happened. In places like Quebec, where Canada's can manufacturing industry is small but growing, the tariffs actually sparked a boom. Yeah, you heard that right. A boom. Here's how it went down. Before the tariffs kicked in, food companies in Canada were heavily reliant on American steel and aluminum for things like canned goods. Think soup cans, tuna cans, you name it. But when the US slapped that 50% tariff on Canadian metals, it also made American steel and aluminum more expensive for Canadian buyers. Suddenly, importing those materials from the US wasn't looking so great. So what did Canadian food companies do? They started looking closer to home. One Quebec-based food can manufacturer, for example, saw its sales more than double in just a few months after the tariffs hit. That's not a typo. Double. Companies that used to import almost all their cans from the US started sourcing from Canadian producers instead. This shift wasn't just a quick fix, it's turning into a game changer for Canada's industrial landscape. Producers are now planning to expand beyond Quebec into places like Ontario, where new facilities are being built to keep up with demand. Take Windsor, for instance. There's a new plant set to open in January that's aiming to churn out over 1 billion cans a year by 2028. That's a billion with a B. This facility alone is expected to create over 100 new jobs, and that's just the start. Another plant in Hamilton is gearing up to handle steel finishing, work that used to be done in the US. So, while the White House thought these tariffs would kneecap Canadian industry, they've actually breathed new life into it. It's like Canada said, challenge accepted, and started building a stronger domestic supply chain. Now, let's flip the script and look at what's happening south of the border. While Canada's can industry is thriving, the US is feeling some serious pain. Those tariffs might have been designed to protect American steel and aluminum producers, but they're hitting American manufacturers and consumers right in the wallet. Here's the deal. Steel and aluminum are key inputs for a ton of industries, everything from cars to construction to canned goods. When you jack up the price of those raw materials with a 50% tariff, it's not just Canadian producers who feel it. American companies that rely on steel and aluminum are now facing higher costs, and those costs are trickling down to consumers like you and me. Take the auto industry, for example. PAR, a major US truck manufacturer, reported in late August 2025 that the tariffs on steel, aluminum and copper added a whopping $75 million to their expenses in just the third quarter. That's one company, one quarter, $75 million. Ouch. Those extra costs mean higher prices for trucks, which means anyone looking to buy a new pickup is going to feel the pinch. And it's not just trucks. Companies like Daimler Truck and Triton, which build vehicles in Mexico under the USMCA trade agreement, are sidestepping these tariffs because their supply chains are set up differently. Their trucks can be up to 3% cheaper than those made in the US, giving them a competitive edge. So, while Trump's tariffs were meant to boost American manufacturing, they're actually making it tougher for US-based companies to compete with their North American rivals. Then there's the grocery store impact. You've probably noticed that canned goods, everything from veggies to soups, are getting pricier. That's because the cost of steel and aluminum for those cans is going up, and American consumers are bearing the brunt. Industry experts are warning that canned food prices could rise across the board, hitting American households where it hurts. The Yale Budget Lab estimates that Trump's 2025 tariff measures could cost the average US household an extra $2,200 to $3,800 a year. For lower-income families, that's a huge burden. You might be thinking, okay, but at least the US steel industry is winning, right? Well, it's not that simple. Yes, American steelmakers are ramping up production. According to the Wall Street Journal, new projects are set to add 21 million tons of steel capacity, which is about a quarter of the US's total output in 2024. That sounds impressive, but there's a catch. Demand isn't keeping up. Construction and auto industries, two of the biggest buyers of steel, are struggling with weak demand. As a result, American steel is now some of the most expensive in the world, sometimes $400 per ton above global benchmarks. That's a problem when you're trying to sell to manufacturers who are already dealing with tight budgets. Analysts are predicting an 11% drop in US vehicle production by 2026 as these higher costs work their way through the supply chain. And it's not just cars. Builders are warning that housing and infrastructure projects are going to get pricier too, as the cost of raw materials skyrockets. So instead of the economic boost Trump was hoping for, the US is facing a situation where its own industries are getting squeezed, and consumers are paying more for everything from cars to canned soup. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. Let's head back to Canada for a moment, because their response to this tariff war is worth talking about. Instead of just firing back with matching tariffs on every US good, Canada's leadership, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, is playing a smarter, more strategic game. In late August 2025, Carney announced a tariff reset. Ottawa lifted some of its retaliatory tariffs on US goods, but kept the pressure on key sectors like steel, aluminum, and autos. This move keeps Canada's leverage intact while opening the door for diplomacy. On the ground, Canadian companies are adapting fast. Food processors are sourcing more cans domestically, and that Hamilton steel finishing plant we mentioned earlier. It's part of a broader push to bring work back to Canada that used to be done in the US. These are long-term investments, and they're not just about surviving the tariffs. They're about reducing Canada's reliance on the US. Mark it all together. Carney's approach is all about steadiness. While Trump thrives on disruption, using tariffs to keep trade partners off balance, Carney is focused on protecting Canada's key industries and keeping negotiation channels open. This contrast was clear when Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc met with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in Washington on August 26th. The 90-minute meeting was described as constructive, with the U.S. acknowledging Canada's decision to ease some counter-tariffs as a positive step. It's a sign that diplomacy might still have a chance to cool things down. Canada's not just sitting back and taking the hit. They've got some serious leverage in this trade war. For one, Canadian tourists used to make up 10 to 15% of daily economic activity in places like Las Vegas. Since the tariff started, that flow has dried up, and US businesses are feeling it. That's the kind of quiet pressure that doesn't make headlines but definitely gets noticed in boardrooms and government offices. Then there's the broader economic strategy. Canada's working to diversify its trade relationships, strengthening ties with Europe, Asia, and Mexico through agreements like the CPTPP, that's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, for those keeping score. Over 90% of Canada's exports to the US are still tariff-free under the USMCA, including big sectors like autos and energy. That gives Canada a strong foundation to negotiate from, without having to cave to Trump's pressure. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford is also stepping up with a $1 billion emergency loan program called the Protecting Ontario Fund. It's aimed at businesses in steel, aluminum and auto manufacturing that are getting hit hard by the tariffs. To qualify, companies need at least 10 employees and $2 million in annual revenue, and they have to have already tapped into federal support programs. Loans range from $250,000 to $40 million, repayable within 6 years, and they're designed to keep payroll stable, facilities running, and layoffs at bay. Ford's also pushing for tax cuts and lower interest rates to keep Ontario's industrial base strong. So, where does this leave us? Trump's tariffs were meant to strengthen the US economy, but they're causing a lot of pain for American manufacturers and consumers. Meanwhile, Canada's turning the tables, using the tariffs as a chance to build up its own industries and reduce reliance on the US. It's a fascinating contrast in strategies. Trump's all about disruption, while Canada, under leaders like Mark Carney and Doug Ford, is playing the long game with a mix of targeted support and smart diplomacy. While the tariffs were supposed to be a win for American industry, they're hitting small businesses hard, really hard. Take Westside Kids, a family-run toy store in New York City that was featured on CBS Evening News. This place had been around for over 40 years, a neighborhood staple selling everything from action figures to board games. But when Trump's tariffs on Chinese imports kicked in during the summer of 2025, 90% of their products, sourced from China, suddenly got a lot pricier. Combine that with competition from online giants like Amazon and a drop in consumer spending as prices rose, and Westside Kids just couldn't keep up. They shut their doors for good. This isn't just one sad story. It's happening across the country. Small businesses, unlike big retailers, don't have the cash flow or storage space to stockpile inventory before tariffs hit. When the cost of imported goods spikes, they're forced to either eat the cost or pass it on to customers. Most customers, feeling their own budgets tighten, just stop buying. The Yale Budget Lab estimates that Trump's 2025 tariff measures are going to cost American households an extra $2,200 to $3,800 a year. That's a big hit, especially for lower-income families who are already stretching every dollar. Think about it. When you're running a small shop, you're already fighting to compete with the Walmarts and Amazons of the world. Add in higher costs for everything from toys to canned goods, and it's a recipe for disaster. Across the US, small businesses are closing up shop, laying off workers, or desperately trying to pivot to domestic suppliers, if they can even find them. It's a ripple effect that's turning Trump's America First strategy into a real challenge for the little guys who keep local economies humming. Now let's zoom out to the global stage, because this tariff war isn't just about steel and aluminum anymore. In early August 2025, the Trump administration dropped a bombshell, a 39% tariff on imported gold bars, targeting Switzerland, the world's biggest gold refining hub. This wasn't just a random move. It was a signal that no commodity, no matter how critical to global trade, is off limits in Trump's tariff playbook. Gold bars, whether they're the 400-ounce ones used by central banks, the 100-ounce ones traded on COMEX, or the 1-kilogram standard popular in Asia, were thought to be untouchable. Traders assumed gold would skate by, safe from the trade war chaos. But then a Swiss refiner got a letter from U.S. Customs confirming that under tariff code 710813550, those gold bars were now subject to a 39% duty. Overnight, gold shipments between the US and Europe ground to a halt. Prices in the US shot up, creating an arbitrage gap where American gold was suddenly way more expensive than European gold. Why does this matter? Well, earlier in 2025, the US had imported 43 metric tons of gold in January alone, nearly double the average monthly output of US refiners, which is about 22 tons. Buyers had been stockpiling to get ahead of potential policy changes, but when the tariffs hit, those stockpiles became the only buffer for the US gold market. This wasn't just a price hike, it was a supply chain rupture that sent shockwaves through global markets. For Canada, the gold tariff is a wake-up call. Gold might not be a huge export to the US, but Canada's got plenty of other strategic resources. Think minerals, energy, even high-end manufacturing, that could be next on Trump's list. The USMCA trade agreement was supposed to protect Canada's exports, but the gold tariff shows how quickly a single policy change can flip decades-old trade flows upside down. If the US can target Switzerland's gold, what's stopping them from going after Canadian oil, natural gas, or even auto parts? It's a reminder that in Trump's trade world, no sector is truly safe. So how's Canada responding to all this? While the US is dealing with rising prices and closing businesses, Canada's leadership is doubling down on a strategy that's all about resilience and long-term thinking. Prime Minister Mark Carney is steering the ship with a calm, calculated approach, and it's starting to pay off. Instead of matching every US tariff with a knee-jerk counter-tariff, Canada's playing a more nuanced game. Back in late August 2025, Carney announced a tariff reset, where Canada lifted some retaliatory tariffs on US goods, but kept the pressure on strategic sectors like steel, aluminum, and autos. This move does two things. It keeps Canada's leverage at the negotiating table, while signalling that they're open to diplomacy. It's like saying we're not backing down, but we're willing to talk. On the ground, Canadian businesses are adapting with impressive speed. Food processors are sourcing more cans domestically, boosting companies like that Quebec can manufacturer we talked about in Part 1. In Hamilton, new steel finishing facilities are being built to handle work that used to go to the US. These aren't short-term fixes, they're multi-year investments that will make Canada less dependent on American markets in the long run. It's a shift from relying on cross-border trade to building a stronger, more self-sufficient Canadian economy. Carney's also looking beyond North America. Canada's deepening trade ties with Europe and Asia through agreements like the CPTPP, and they're working with Mexico on a $120 billion Northern Corridor trade route that would bypass the US entirely. This isn't just about dodging tariffs, it's about making sure Canada's economy isn't at the mercy of unpredictable US policies. Over 90% of Canada's exports to the US are still tariff-free under the USMCA, including big-ticket items like autos and energy. That gives Canada a solid foundation to negotiate from, without having to cave to Trump's pressure. Let's zoom in on Ontario, where Premier Doug Ford is stepping up to protect the province's industrial heartland. Ontario's a powerhouse for steel, aluminum and auto manufacturing, so these tariffs hit especially hard here. Ford's response? A $1 billion emergency loan program called the Protecting Ontario Fund, designed to keep businesses afloat and workers employed. Here's how it works. Businesses in sectors like steel, aluminum, and autos can apply for loans ranging from $250,000 to $40 million, repayable within 6 years. To qualify, they need at least 10 employees, $2 million in annual revenue, and they have to have already used federal tariff support programs. The goal is to stabilize payrolls, keep factories running, and prevent layoffs or closures. Ford's not stopping there. He's also pushing for tax cuts, GST reductions, and pressuring the Bank of Canada to lower interest rates to make it easier for businesses to invest and grow. This is a proactive defense, not just a reaction. Ford's making it clear that Ontario's not going to wait around for the US to play nice. By supporting key industries and encouraging investment, he's helping to shield the province from the worst of the tariff storm. On the diplomatic front, Canada's holding its own. That August 26th meeting between Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was a big deal. It lasted 90 minutes, and both sides called it constructive. The US even acknowledged Canada's decision to lift some counter-tariffs as a positive step. That's not to say everything's rosy, far from it. But it shows that Canada's approach of combining firm pushback with open dialogue is keeping the conversation alive. Carney's strategy is all about avoiding the kind of rushed, lopsided deal that South Korea and the EU signed under Trump's pressure. Former Canadian Minister of International Trade Mary Neng has been vocal about this, calling the 35% tariffs on Canadian goods unsustainable for both sides. She points out that the North American supply chain is so integrated that higher costs for Canadian exporters end up hurting American manufacturers, importers, and consumers. Her message is clear. Canada wants a good deal, not just any deal. Let's talk numbers for a second. Trump's team has been touting a 3% GDP increase in Q2 2025 as proof that their tariff strategy is working. But economists, including those cited in Commerce Department briefings, say that growth was mostly a technical bounce. Businesses rushed to stockpile imports before the tariffs hit, which artificially boosted the numbers. The reality? Trump claimed in April to have made 200 trade deals, but by August the actual number was closer to 8. Canada, notably, wasn't one of them. This gap between rhetoric and reality is starting to show. The US is alienating key trade partners, and the costs are piling up at home. American steel is now some of the priciest in the world, and industries like construction and autos are struggling to keep up. Meanwhile, Canada's building new trade routes, investing in domestic industries, and preparing for a future where they rely less on the US. Let's not forget the people caught in the middle of this. In Windsor, Ontario, auto workers are waiting to see if their jobs will survive the next round of policy shifts. In the US, families are feeling the sting of higher prices at the grocery store and beyond. And then there's the story of that New York toy store, West Side Kids, closing after 4 decades. These aren't just statistics. They're real people, real livelihoods, and real communities feeling the fallout of this trade war. Canada's response, led by Carney and Ford, is focused on protecting those workers and businesses. Whether it's through emergency loans, new trade agreements, or smart diplomacy, they're showing that Canada's not just going to roll over. They're building a sustainable, resilient economy that can weather the storm. We're diving into the political and cultural fallout, the broader implications for global trade, and whether Trump's tariff strategy is sustainable for the US in the long run. So grab a drink, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let's get into the final chapter of this economic saga. Let's start with the political side of things. By August 1st, 2025, President Trump upped the ante, raising tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by the USMCA from 25% to 35%. This wasn't just a tweak. It was a bold move to pressure Canada into signing a last-minute trade deal. Unlike South Korea or the EU, who caved under similar pressure, Canada stood firm. Prime Minister Mark Carney made it clear, Canada's not signing a deal that doesn't serve its national interests. No rushed agreements, no bad terms. It's a stance that's resonating with Canadians, who are tired of being pushed around in trade talks. This tariff hike wasn't just about economics, it carried serious symbolic weight. The US and Canada have one of the most stable trade relationships in the world, built on decades of cooperation, shared borders, and agreements like the USMCA. But Trump's move signaled a shift from partnership to confrontation. Former US Ambassador to Canada David Cohen warned that these actions are eroding trust that took years to build, especially after the Biden administration worked to repair ties strained during Trump's first term. When you mess with a relationship as tight as U.S. Canada, there are consequences, and we're seeing them play out in real time. Canada's response has been calm, but resolute. Instead of matching Trump's drama with podium outbursts or blanket counter-tariffs, Carney's team is playing a long game. They've kept negotiation channels open, as seen in that constructive August 26th meeting between Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. But they're also sending a clear message. Canada won't be bullied. This approach is winning support at home, where Canadians are rallying around the idea of standing up for their economic sovereignty. Speaking of Canadians, let's talk about how regular folks are reacting. The mood in Canada isn't one of panic, it's more like quiet determination. People are frustrated, sure, but they've seen this playbook before. Back in Trump's first term, Canada hit back with targeted tariffs on U.S. goods like whiskey, which caused real political headaches south of the border. That memory still lingers, and today, many Canadians are pushing for long-term resilience over short-term retaliation. Some provincial leaders, like Ontario's Premier Doug Ford, are calling for stronger measures, like pulling American alcohol off shelves or rethinking procurement processes to favour Canadian suppliers. But the broader public sentiment is less about tit-for-tat and more about building a stronger, more self-sufficient Canada. People are tired of the unpredictability that comes with Trump's trade policies. They see his approach as less about diplomacy and more about theatre, big gestures designed to dominate headlines rather than solve problems. Carney's tapped into this mood with his focus on building sustainably, building together, building positively, as he put it in a public address. It's a message of confidence, not fear. Canadians know their economy is strong. 95% of their exports to the US remain tariff-free under the USMCA, covering critical sectors like autos and energy. That gives Canada room to maneuver without buckling under pressure. It's not about outshouting Trump, it's about outlasting him. One of the most intriguing developments in this trade war is Canada's pivot to new trade partnerships. Behind the scenes, Canada and Mexico are working on a $120 billion Northern Corridor trade route that would bypass the US entirely. This isn't just a pipe dream. It's a concrete plan to make trade between Canada and Mexico easier and more efficient, cutting out the uncertainty of US policy shifts. It's a quiet but powerful signal that Canada's preparing for a future where the US might not be as reliable a partner. This move comes alongside Canada's efforts to deepen ties with other global players. Through agreements like the CPTPP, that's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, Canada's strengthening trade links with Europe, Asia, and beyond. These deals aren't just about diversifying export markets, they're about reducing Canada's dependence on the US, which has long been its biggest trading partner. By spreading their economic bets, Canada's making sure they're not left scrambling if Trump's tariffs escalate further. Let's flip back to the US for a moment. Trump's tariff strategy is all about projecting strength, using economic pressure to bend other countries to his will. On his 200th day in office, he slapped new tariffs on dozens of countries, from Canada to Switzerland to China. His team points to a 3% GDP bump in the second quarter of 2025 as proof that it's working. But dig a little deeper, and the picture's murkier. Economists, including those cited in Commerce Department briefings, say that growth was mostly a technical fluke. Businesses stockpiled imports before tariffs hit, creating a temporary spike. Trump's also been vocal about making 200 trade deals, but by August 2025, the real number was closer to 8. That gap between rhetoric and reality is starting to catch up with him. Every tariff that hits a key ally like Canada risks pushing the US toward isolation. The US-Canada relationship isn't just about trade. It's about defense, intelligence, and cultural ties that have been rock solid for decades. But with each new tariff, that foundation takes a hit. And then there's the domestic fallout. American consumers are facing higher prices for everything from canned goods to cars. Small businesses, like that New York toy store we talked about in Part 2, are closing under the weight of tariff-driven costs. The Yale Budget Lab's estimate of $2,200 to $3,800 in extra costs per household is hitting lower-income families hardest. And CBS News polls show that while Americans think the economy's doing okay, they're bracing for price hikes in the months ahead. Let's circle back to that gold tariff we touched on in Part 2, because it's a perfect example of how Trump's strategy can backfire. The 39% tariff on imported gold bars aimed at Switzerland didn't just disrupt the gold market, it sent a message to every US trading partner, including Canada. If gold, a commodity long considered untouchable, can be hit with a tariff, then nothing's off limits. For Canada, this is a warning that sectors like energy, strategic minerals, or even high-tech manufacturing could be next. The gold tariff caused an immediate supply chain shock. Shipments between the US and Europe stopped cold, and US gold prices spiked, creating an arbitrage gap that's still causing headaches for traders. Canada's not a major gold exporter to the US, but they're watching closely. The same logic that hit Switzerland could easily apply to Canadian commodities like oil, natural gas, or critical minerals used in everything from batteries to aerospace. It's a reminder that Trump's tariffs are less about strategy and more about keeping everyone guessing. What makes Canada's response so fascinating is how it balances short-term defense with long-term vision. While Trump's focused on quick wins and headline-grabbing moves, Carney and Ford are building for the future. Ontario's $1 billion Protecting Ontario Fund, which we covered in Part 2, is keeping businesses afloat with loans from $250,000 to $40 million. It's not just about survival, it's about giving companies the breathing room to invest in new facilities, hire more workers, and compete globally. Carney's diplomatic approach is just as calculated. By keeping talks open with the US while strengthening ties with Mexico, Europe, and Asia, he's making sure Canada's not backed into a corner. Even as Trump pushes for concessions, Canada's holding firm refusing to sign a deal that doesn't work for them. Former Trade Minister Mary Ng summed it up perfectly. These tariffs are unsustainable for both sides. The integrated North American supply chain means that higher costs for Canadian exporters end up hurting American manufacturers and consumers too. At the end of the day, this trade war isn't just about numbers, it's about people. In Windsor, Ontario, auto workers are holding their breath, wondering if their jobs will survive the next policy shift. In the US, families are cutting back on spending as prices climb. And in communities across both countries, there's a growing sense that this cycle of escalation can't go on forever. Canada's betting on endurance. By investing in domestic industries, diversifying trade partners, and keeping diplomacy alive, they're positioning themselves to weather the storm. Trump, meanwhile, faces a tougher question. Can his tariff strategy deliver the economic wins he's promised before the costs at home, higher prices, closed businesses, and strained alliances, become too much to bear? That's a wrap on our three-part deep dive into the U.S. Canada trade war. From steel and aluminum to gold, from small businesses to global markets, this tariff clash is reshaping economies and testing relationships. Canada's playing a smart, steady game, turning a challenge into an opportunity to build a stronger, more resilient economy. The U.S., on the other hand, is grappling with the unintended consequences of a strategy that's starting to look more like a gamble. What do you think? Can Canada keep outplaying the US in this trade war, or is Trump's pressure going to force a deal? And how are you feeling the impact of rising prices where you are? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let me know what other topics you want us to tackle next. Thanks for sticking with me through this series. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and I'll catch you in the next one.